financing of the armed forces of Ukraine, the security bloc, and an action plan in case of new Russian aggression. These are the three components of the system of guarantees that President Zelensky envisions for Ukraine. According to the head of state, firstly, our partners must commit to at least not reducing financial assistance for the personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine. As for weaponry, it must be Ukrainian, European, and also American, procured through a European-funded purchasing system. Secondly, Zelensky says that if Ukraine is not being admitted to NATO, our partners must propose an alternative security bloc. And thirdly, the states guaranteeing Ukraine's security must clearly develop an action plan detailing who and how will respond in the event of renewed Russian aggression on land, at sea, and in the air. Moreover, Ukraine will strongly demand that the future security document be legally binding and enforceable under international law.
These crucial security guarantees, originating from key European countries, at least the most significant ones, and from the powerful United States of America, were indeed strongly supported and formally endorsed by their respective parliaments and by the United States Congress. Yes, we unequivocally desire genuinely legally binding security guarantees. We emphatically do not want another non-binding Budapest memorandum, nor do we seek a repetition of the ineffective Minsk agreements. Instead, our clear and resolute demand is for a truly serious, comprehensive, and enforceable international document.
The Ukrainian delegation held a meeting in New York with Steve Witkoff, the special representative of the U.S. president. As stated by the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, the key priority of the negotiations is to advance real diplomatic work and implement all the agreements reached in Washington. At the same time, our representatives emphasized that Russia is not taking steps to end the war, but on the contrary is intensifying it. And the recent shelling of Kyiv, which killed 25 people, is evidence of this. Whether we should expect any reaction to this attack, we will ask TSN correspondent in the United States, Olga Koshelenko. She is live with the studio now. Congratulations, Olga. So, what details do you already have about today's negotiations?
Greetings, colleagues. Yes, these negotiations started quite early at 6:45 a.m. local New York time. And in addition to Andriy Yermak, the head of the president's office, the negotiations with Steve Witkoff, the special representative of the president of the United States, were also attended by the first deputy minister of foreign affairs of Ukraine, Serhiy Kyslytsya. And at the beginning of the meeting, Yermak had the opportunity to inform his counterpart about the latest war crimes committed by Russia, in particular that horrific airstrike on Kyiv during the night before Thursday. He, as Yermak told us, we had the chance to speak with him just a few minutes ago. He said that he showed Witkoff some photographs that hadn't even been made publicly available. And according to him, Witkoff's reaction to this was very emotional. As for how other American officials are reacting publicly, I'll talk about that a bit later. What else did they discuss? Well, first of all, the head of the office emphasizes that, as he says, no one is pressuring Ukraine to give up its territories or to agree to the so-called territorial exchange. And of course, they talked about security guarantees, which both sides are currently working on. And according to Andriy Yermak, the United States, represented by Steve Witkoff, once again reaffirmed their commitment to the idea of guarantees similar to Article 5 of the NATO Charter, where all members respond and react to an attack on any one of them. And according to Yermak, they also discussed the possibility of a summit, a meeting at the presidential level. Let me remind you that it was precisely about this, holding direct talks between Putin and Zelensky, that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced on August 18th after a meeting at the White House with the President of Ukraine and European leaders. But as we can see right now, this meeting, let's put it this way, is not only not happening, there isn't even a hint that it might take place. And Andriy Yermak said that he pointed this out to Steve Witkoff, and in his opinion, the United States will sooner or later have to realize that Russia is not a reliable negotiating partner and should eventually move towards imposing sanctions against it. And they also invited Witkoff to visit Ukraine. But the reaction of the United States to Russia's strikes on residential areas of Kyiv was not only as emotional as Andriy Yermak described. In fact, one could have publicly expected more. Only the US President's special representative for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, openly condemned it, making a post on X. He published photos of the destruction and noted that this attack was the second most powerful since the start of the full-scale invasion. 600 drones and 31 missiles were used. He accompanied it with the following text: "The targets are not soldiers and weapons, but residential areas of Kyiv, attacks on civilian trains, the offices of EU and UK missions, as well as innocent civilians. These outrageous attacks threaten the peace that the President of the United States seeks." But when the White House spokesperson was asked about this, specifically whether she agreed with such wording, she replied that the question was not whether she agreed, but noted that she had spoken with President Trump, and according to him, the attack on Kyiv was an unpleasant but expected event. He said that this was a direct response to Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries, which, in Trump's opinion, may indicate that neither side is ready for peace.
The two countries have been at war for a very long time. Russia carried out this attack on Kyiv just as Ukraine recently struck Russian oil refineries. In fact, they disabled 20% of Russia's oil refining capacity during their attacks in August. So the president continues to closely monitor this. And these killings, unfortunately, will continue as long as the war goes on. That's why the president wants it to end.
And despite this, the United States has just approved the sale of more than 3,000 IRAM cruise missiles to Ukraine. Their range is between 240 and 450 kilometers. And this is the largest arms sale to Ukraine since the beginning of this administration in the United States. The corresponding announcement appeared on the official web portal of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. And according to the Wall Street Journal, IRAM missiles could arrive in Ukraine in as little as 6 weeks. But in order to strike targets in Russia, Ukraine must coordinate its targets with the head of the Pentagon, Mr. Austin. $825 million for the missiles will be paid by Denmark, the Netherlands and Norway, with partial funding from the United States. The shelling of Ukraine also prompted protests in the United States, with demonstrations in Washington near the White House and in New York at Times Square. The day before, both Ukrainian refugees and Americans who support Ukraine were there. They came out to draw attention to the terrorist nature of Russia's actions and to emphasize that strikes on an oil refinery, which supplies money to Russia's budget and fuel for Russian military equipment, cannot be equated with the killing of innocent civilians.
The strikes hit exactly the area where I used to live and where my family still lives now. I was on the phone with my parents all night, and seeing such a number of damages, so many people killed in places where you grew up, places that were dear to you, is incredibly hard.
And I think it's very clear to everyone that Russia is the aggressor here, and that this strike is a deliberate attack on civilian infrastructure, which was completely unjustified regardless of what happened in previous wars. I believe this is a terrible tragedy.
Ms. Levitz expressed her perspective, stating that she drew a direct and concerning parallel, an equivalence between Russia's actions, specifically their strikes on civilians in Kyiv, and Ukraine's strategic strikes on oil refineries located within Russia. She elaborated that the latter, the strikes on oil refineries, constitute a legitimate military target, thereby distinguishing them from the former, which she implied were not legitimate under the circumstances. The fact that the White House says this, that Trump says this, Trump says one thing today, another tomorrow. I've stopped paying attention to what he says at all because he just generates white noise. And today, in just over an hour, we are expecting an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council, convened at Ukraine's request. It will, of course, be dedicated to these latest war crimes committed by Russia. And according to our information, the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yulia Sviridenko, will also take part in this meeting, and she will brief the world's diplomats firsthand, so to speak, about what is happening here.